Okay, so in this session we are showing you and taking you through what we call the Regulatory Reform Toolkit, which is one of the most important outputs of the project. We are travelling here a couple of balancing objectives which we hope work in our favour. Let me explain. We of course want to show you the toolkit and what it does, what we're aiming for it to do, and how it can be used for all kinds of research relating to regulation. At the same time, we are seeking your comments and feedback. So we are showing you something that we have a plan and is developed here, but is not complete, because of course if we complete it and it's an online device, then your feedback becomes somewhat illusory. And so I'm also going to talk at the end a little bit about some of the processes for feedback. So obviously feedback, questions, comments today are very useful, but we are going to eventually move to a more formal user testing phase, which I'll talk about. So overall, the purpose of the toolkit, it is really, as suggests at the top, that it's to enable you to access and use information and research about regulation. It is online based, however what I'm showing you today is actually not live on the internet, rather this is the structure within the fibre of the university where this is being built. Many of the people involved in adding and subtracting bits know that that would not be a good idea to do at this particular moment, because there's different designers with access to it. So I'm showing you this version. So that is of course the disclaimer. I have the good support from team here should the entire system immediately collapse, but we've taken precautionary measures against that. Okay, so yeah, exactly, fully analysed in multiple jurisdictions. Okay, so as we say, it's to enable you to access and use information and research about the regulation. So many of you are aware that within the project we have 2 books and we have a set of cross-cutting papers which we also plan to publish as a volume. And all power to the academic institutions and what we do and produce research in books. But part of this project is, of course, to have a dialogue and discussion about regulation for a broader audience. Many of the practitioner community, policymakers, also of course read books and papers. Many people interested in regulation from the public perspective also read that kind of traditional literature. What we're doing here is looking at it in a different way and providing a different set of headings. So there is a hard copy version of this first page in your pack, as I mentioned at the beginning of yesterday. And what I'm going to do first is show you some details in the toolkit. Then you can see my team of friends here, Andy and Derek, who you know well, are then actually going to role play a problem or a potential issue through the toolkit, so we can see it's sort of in action. They're making use of PowerPoint, which for that might be a little more stable, we're hoping. And John Yeabsley, also part of the project, of course, will do some summary points at the end. Just housekeeping matters. From there, we'll move to Sir Geoffrey Palmer, who's volunteered, with a little bit of persuasion, but volunteered to give us some wrap-up points of the day, and then we'll, so the conference, yesterday and today, and then we'll move to close the event. So, the toolkit. The primary function on the first page is to show you what's in it. It gives you this menu-based 4-quadrant formula. Now, one of the features of the toolkit is that as it will be web-based, you do indeed scroll through it, like so. Given the way in which technology works, if you really want to search this on your smartphone, it will actually shrink to the size of your smartphone and all those details as well. It will also angle itself to fit your iPad or, being technology neutral, your Samsung tablet, whichever it is. So we'll come to the detail of the 4 quadrants in a minute. When you constantly have it, you also have the 4 quadrants as a sort of a site map at the bottom. So once you leave the first page. Now, incidentally, all of this double bracket going on isn't because we've suddenly got a punctuation fetish beyond reason, I should say. It's entirely there because this is not online. The moment it's live on the web, all of those extra brackets you're going to see just disappear. So I ask you to sort of tolerate that at present. This is things we do. Okay. So returning to these 4 quadrants, you can see the first one here about regulation, and under it a number of points that really talk about regulation. In this project, as you would have gathered, we have no one standing of definition of regulation. I doubt that makes us distinct from many research-related things into regulation around the world. To the extent that we've adopted a definition, it really is the broad one about regulating and changing behaviour. There was some discussion yesterday about what do you mean by regulation and so on, and that's not an unimportant point. What this side of the toolkit does is it really looks at, well, what do we mean by regulation? Definitions, legal methods, substantive types, who can regulate, and you can see the headings and so on. And that is really designed to get you into the topic. Many people here, of course, know plenty about this, but I suggest to you that this will be quite useful, and I'll show you some of what underlies this quadrant in a minute. Moving across to the identifying and addressing a regulatory need or opportunity. So more detail of this will come out in the role play that I'll move to soon, and particularly the triggers for action. But you can see that these invite you to investigate what is it that you're looking at regulation for? What is it that's triggering you to think that you have a regulatory opportunity, a regulatory need? What's driving and shaping where you get there? Do you need new regulation to change existing regulation, and so on? In this quadrant here, there are direct links to topics of regulatory interest. I won't take you through the list one by one, but you can see that it refers directly to topics that we have dealt with in this project. And over in this quadrant, similar, more topics and some additions. Now, under all of these lies some detail, some breakdown, and we talk about this as being the levels of the toolkit. So what I'm going to do is show you the level in the top left-hand quarter in just a moment. But before I do, I'm going to explain what the toolkit relies on, and then show you this. So at the bottom of the toolkit, although bottom more as a metaphorical sort of computer sense, the data that lies behind the toolkit really comes from 2 broad sources. One is the work within the project. So all of the papers within the project form the data from which these headings come. But we recognise, as we've said, that we've chosen 17 research streams that we've developed into 15 further papers with 5 cross-cutting theme topics. And the world of regulation is, of course, endless. So one of the other features of the toolkit is that we prey a little bit on the outside world, so there are links to things. So and some of these links we're currently getting permission for, but for example, if a paper refers to the work of Fiona Haynes in a particular paper, maybe that refers to 3 types of risks and what actuarial risk and so on is, there might be a link where you could actually go and look at that as well. Whereas what one, of course, would do in the traditional media is look at the footnote, find it, and so on and so forth. So we're starting with us, we're building to outside links. Another type of outside link would be where the regulatory management paper talks about regulatory impact assessments. It might in fact link to both the Treasury material and also Australian Productivity Commission material and so on. That forms part of the role play that you'll see shortly, so I'll leave that aside. But to give you an overview of some of the toolkit's functionality, I'm going to take you through definitions. So you can decide, gosh, I'd like to say something about definitions. And at the moment we have this split, and you can see as you progress that you also have this site map, so you know where you are, into functional definitions and thematic definitions. So when you click here, for example, you can find a number of references and definitions about regulation. from a variety of sources, many of which are cited in the project, some of which are not. And what we are doing in this area and other areas is not overloading you, because in fact you could have thousands of definitions, but what we've done is we have chosen key samples that are illustrative of types of definition. Okay, so the John Braithwaite definition of regulating and changing behaviour is, of course, one we've adopted, and you can find literally hundreds and thousands of references in it. We don't intend in this toolkit to do that bibliographic task, which is not necessarily useful. Rather, we have key highlighted definitions. As part of that, there are some that we believe are more useful than others, and we are inventing a sort of not a grading system, because we're not going to give everyone a grade. It's not designed to be a school test, but we do highlight ones that we think are particularly useful. You can see here that there is a link to the Ministry of Economic Development paper from which this came. If I scroll through some of these, and at the moment, so I ask your tolerance, we're reorganising a bit of this, so there's a bit more data here, but the whole thing works on the scroll function. You can scroll through. Now, this particular definition, if you like, comes from one of the papers in the project, one authored by Dean Knight and Rayneth Waite's Review and Appeal of Regulatory Decisions. When you're in this sort of definition, you are given options. You can skip to the section in the paper. When you do skip to the section in the paper, it highlights the section you're in. What are the types of regulatory decisions? You can think, okay, this is really useful and I want to read what they say in the paper. You are actually in the paper having done that so that you can do that. Alternatively, you can think, well, that wasn't the definition I was hoping for, and in fact, your sitemap will follow you, so that just is a minor thing, but you can go back to definitions, and you will be able to actually go back to the previous screen. So that's a bit of functionality for you without talking you through all of the definitions. So if I go into thematic definitions, Mark Bennett and Joel Colin-Rios, you're familiar with the public participation work we've discussed a lot in the last 2 days. Last time I showed you, you can skip to the selection in the paper. You could just skip to the view the paper. You will eventually be able to download the full paper. You can't quite do that immediately. It's incumbent upon me to have struck a little bit of a copyright deal with our publisher, but you will be able to actually download the full paper within a shorter period of time. Once we've sold out all the books, of course. No, it's not like that at all. Okay, but the idea, of course, really is that you can extract parts of the papers. So if your purpose in being in the toolkit is to find out about definitions of regulation and so on, then that's what you can find. If your purpose is to think, what are the triggers for action and so on, then that's what you find. So it's in a sense a way of cutting and pasting the work into different formats, but having said that, we consider it much more than cutting and pasting. It's making it sort of very functional and we hope very useful. So in putting this together and in seeking your feedback, let me tell you a little more about it. So it's probably sort of implicit in what I'm saying, but if I expand a little bit, well, who is the toolkit for? Well, we have been very conscious of designing it for multiple audiences, and we recognise the challenges and good and bad challenges that brings. So we have in mind people working in policy in various areas of regulation. We have in mind students of regulation, researchers, by which you don't just necessarily have to form the student role. I think probably everyone is a student of one kind or another in regulation. By creating something with multiple audiences, we recognise that some parts may feel more useful to other parts to some audiences. If I return to the thematic definitions line and skip into the full section of the paper, I want to explain something to you which it's really sort of essentially impossible to show you until the whole thing is live. So this is where I ask you to bear with this. We're balancing between the live version and the building version. If you did skip to this definition in the paper, the orange line down the side, which incidentally, primarily usefully, although a little bit aesthetically, but primarily usefully, will change colour according to which quadrant you're in. So there are various ways of mapping your path, which we have good advice on, appeals to people who learn in different ways, right? Because some of us follow colour better, some of us follow words better, and a mixture of both. And that's really just designed so you don't get lost in the toolkit. I think we all have experiences of databases where you find something really interesting and you think, how do I get back to where I was on page 24 previously? And was I there at all? And where did it go? And so how we've dealt with that is several things. Firstly, the search function, which is on the top page, actually searches the toolkit and nothing else. You'd have that experience with a marvellous entity, Google, where they have searches in web pages and you quite frequently aren't really entirely sure where you're searching. You think you're searching the Met Office and you discover you've in fact just found out what the climate is in North Carolina. Okay, so here you are. So one function is the colour clearly indicates you've jumped to this part of the paper. One of the usability functions that we've asked for and that will be in there is that you will also be able to follow the citation of the paper. So if you think, oh, that's a great definition now, I think I was in the Mark Bennett paper, it will actually pop up at the top of the screen for you, so you don't have to do that. On the right-hand side, and what is clearly blank at the moment, is that there is also another line that will appear, which essentially in some of the papers there are 3 or 4 useful bits to the level you're above. So I'm showing you from the definitions. In some papers there are 3 or 4 definitions and they actually discuss the competing goals between those definitions. When you're here, you'll be able to see little crosses they appear, which when you mouse over tells you further definition here, further definition here. So those are things that software people have been very conscious of making this usable, because what we are really avoiding or trying to avoid very hard to create is another database that doesn't take people very far. So there's a bit of interdisciplinary communication of another type going on there. So far it's working well. So when you are here, and you've gone into this paper, so you've gone in to look at the definition, you can see the chapter you're in, you can see the variety of options, how you got there. The sitemap follows you on the side. So those are all click-back menus. I use the back browser because of the way I'm demonstrating it to you, but of course, if I should have mentioned, whilst you're in functional definitions, you can of course get to it that way. You can get to legal methods this way. Let me just show you so you can see the utility. Legal methods, the types of legal methods, acts of parliament, secondary legislation, definitions, tertiary legislation, codes of conduct. And under this are explanations, simple explanations actually of what these are. Of course, one of the funnest explanations that one of the researchers wrote is what is an Act of Parliament, something which is frequently taken for granted but is actually worthwhile consideration. And each of those follows a path, like the one I illustrated earlier, further down. Substantive types. This seems to be partially loaded on this view, so I apologise for that. But what I was going to show you, it doesn't matter now, but substantive types, rather than taking the legal method, actually looks at the type. Is it market-based regulation, performance-based regulation, command and control regulation? And so that's when the not entirely a legal non-lawyer split, but we've done this idea of looking at it through instrumentalism, but also through substantive types. And again, this takes you to a variety of sources and so on. So At this particular stage, I've given you an overview of really the functionality of the toolkit. I'm shortly going to pass on so that you can see a little bit of a role play in action just to test our functionality. Before I do so, I'm just going to return to the front screen. The front screen here, and point out a couple of things. As I mentioned before, you have the search function which enables you to search the toolkit, and that actually follows you as you pass through the screens. So you can always have the search function. When you're in the midst of the toolkit, it actually hits the bottom of the toolkit. You can, I've blown this up a bit so you can see it on the screen. It's inflated there, but you can shrink it as well so you can see the whole page at the same time if you really want to, but you know, that's a question of your optical capabilities and so on. Let me just check that I haven't left any details out. When you are in this level of the toolkit, here's the search engine where it appears, and what we are also adding and it's just a little hard to see here, but I thought I'd go back to this page. So I was here earlier. This is where you jump to the definition and it's highlighted in the paper. In what is currently the grey on the left-hand side, this is where there will also be the possibility of jumping to other sources. So you might jump to an external source that's helpful in the discussion and so on. Additional matters such as details of footnotes and so on is that when you do this, when you mouse over it, it will actually appear. The papers don't appear as they appear obviously in written form. They in fact appear as endnotes, and they're somewhere else than the written text. So that's the reference there. So what I'll do next is pass on to the role players who will take you into a little bit more detail on this, and then we're happy to answer questions, and John at the end is actually going to also help us provoke some questions. So
thank you. Okay, are these the slides?
yes,
okay.
yes, that's you.
Thank you. Right, so we've been tasked with running through a sort of a hypothetical as to Derek and I are going to be a couple of users of this site, and we're just going to sort of see what shakes down. One of the things that's going to happen is, as Susy was saying, the site's under construction. People are figuring out how it should work and how it's best going to work. To sort of make that task manageable, a lot of the construction loading up of material has focused on the first quadrant that Susy's taken you through, which is the definitions. You'll be relieved to know that our example isn't going to just spend its time wallowing around in definitions. So we're going to go off into parts of the site that are less under construction, and so there's going to be a mix here of screenshots of what you'd see on the site, plus just some ordinary PowerPoint slides that will show you the kind of material that will be loaded up, the links that the user would see, the sort of levels and so on. So that's where we're going. The example that we thought we would take would be, I'm going to be a regulatory bod, say regulatory manager at one of the major energy companies. Derek's going to be a policy manager at, say, MB or one of the policy shops around town. And we're both reacting to the Labour Greens electricity reform proposal. So, just to recap on the Labour Greens reform proposal, and I'm reading from some of the material that was released by the press conference the other day, David Parker, and sort of followed up with a bit of detail. So, what are the Labour Greens proposing to do? I'm focusing on the Labour. They are going to dump the current model and introduce a fairer pricing system where each generator will be paid the actual cost of generation and a fair return on their capital. Sounds good. Of course, the wholesale market is going to be replaced by this new Crown entity, NZ Power, which is going to be a single buyer of the electricity from these generators. They quickly make the point, many states in the US, as well as large economies like Brazil and South Africa, use similar systems to this. NZ Power, having bought this, bought the power off these generators, will, of course, on-sell to retailers on the basis of long-term contracts. NZ Power or Transpower will decide on the sort of operational basis as to which generation gets dispatched in which half hour. They'll also be able to direct generators to use available capacity, so generators will no longer have the sort of choice as to whether when and how they operate their capacity into the market. And finally, NZ Power may take on the majority of all current regulatory functions and power, so it may replace the Electricity Authority. Going forward, it will determine future investment needs for both generation and transmission, so it will decide where we need more generation, where we need more transmission. Where it decides we need more generation, then it's going to run a tender process for new generation on the basis of, here's what we want, we're offering a long-term contract, who's wanting to build this station or that station. And they also, as a throwaway, they're going to simplify the regulation of lines companies, which...
Before lunch.
Before lunch, yeah. Just when I thought that practice area was winding down. So that's the basic proposal, right? And so I'm not Andy Nicholls at Chapman Tripp. I'm Andy Nicholls at one of the major energy companies. I'm in the regulatory team. I'm thinking, crikey dick. But I've got and Derek's the same. Derek's it's a proposal from the opposition, obviously. We've got a bit of time to think about it, and we've heard that there's this new toolkit in town, and that this might actually help us to get a bit of a rangefinder on how we should be thinking about this. So with no further ado, Derek. So there's the front screen, right? And so you look at the front screen, and if you're us, then of course your eye immediately gets caught on, there's an electricity and telecommunications tab down here on the topics of regulatory interest, the pink topic down there. So we click on that. What do we see? We drill down, we immediately see there's some papers here on, these are the first two papers are from the first two stages of this project, so they're papers that were produced in this research project. One is the history of regulation in electricity and telecommunications, and the second one takes that further and analyses the issues that drop out of that saga. There was also a link here to public participation paper from Mark and Joel, because they used the electricity sector as a real example of a real context in which they could road test their ideas around public participation. Now, in my role, I'm in the major energy participant. I drill down again. We won't take you through to the exact papers, but I drill down again, and I've got two really quite substantive papers on the history of regulation in these sectors and the issues that have dropped out right up until current day. From my perspective, there's a couple of useful things that will drop out of that. One is that it gives me the history of electricity reforms, and to the extent that these are being pitched, these changes from Labour and the Greens are being pitched as the sort of the final death knell of the so-called Bradford reforms. I might not have lived through those reforms. I might have, I haven't been in the job for the last 15, 20 years. So actually an analysis of how we have come to be here is a useful start, and the analysis of the issues currently facing the sector. Are these reform proposals that are on the table, are they addressing the problems that these independent analysts have identified in the sector? The other thing, I click on this and I see that actually this is about electricity and telecommunications, and one of the things I noticed in the telco discussion is that the telco sector has recently been through exactly this experience. They've had a major policy proposal developed by the National Party when it was in opposition, ran on which is the UFB, 1.5 billion of your dollars being spent on a fibre network, developed in opposition, taken on the campaign trail, and once in government, and they were successful at the election, obviously. Key's government was committed to rolling it out. feels like a similar dynamic to what we've got here, which is a proposal developed in opposition, and if they're elected, there'll be a real expectation that it's not about should we do this, but how do we do it. And there's some insights that drop out of the telco paper, which again get me thinking about where I'm at now with my current example. What about you, Derek, in your seat up on the terrace?
Well, I haven't worked on electricity for quite a while, and I didn't understand anything that happened after the Bradford reforms, so I'd start here.
Right.
I'd start on the screen, kind of why on earth are we where we are?
Yep.
And what was in people's minds. And most probably jump from there to having a look at a couple of other jurisdictions that have gone this way.
Yes.
And what's known about that.
Yes, that's right. The claim that...
Is there a decent evaluation of kind of what Ontario's done or whatever?
Yep. Okay. So then we exhaust ourselves on coming up to speed on the context. Go back to the top screen. The easy link was telco and electricity. We've explored that. The next thing that catches the eye is up on the top right. Triggers for action. We're certainly in a space where we've had an unusual trigger for action. Let's click on that. We're sort of drilling down to sort of pull that topic apart a little bit. The bottom link, obviously, is where we're at, a party-driven imperative. We click on that, because that's absolutely where we're at. We get to a part of the site that's not yet constructed, but there'll be at least these kind of links. And Derek, the first two are going to be of sort of academic interest for me, but it looks to me like, again, the folk on the terrace would be thinking, what do I do with this proposal from the opposition? Yeah,
because it puts you in a public servant in a difficult position. I mean, there's a comment in the conference about how your job is just to do what the minister wants. I actually think you have a responsibility that's far wider than that. One way of framing that is you have a responsibility to the Governor-General. The Governor-General recognises the government. The Governor-General recognises Her Majesty's loyal opposition. And His Majesty's loyal opposition may become the owner of the business shortly, so we better be able to respond to both sides of the house. So I'd most probably have a bit of a look at the SSC's guidance on kind of what's the roles and responsibilities of a public servant, and particularly dig into stuff on political neutrality. I mean, this is an area where anything you do is not politically neutral. It's just you try and be non-partisan. You can't be politically neutral. Everything we do in this space is political because it's political now.
Doug Heffernan didn't click on that link.
But if I were to click on that link, actually what I'd find is it talks about the pre-election kind of window where the government stops making decisions and caretaker mode after the election, which is not where we are.
Right.
So I'd kind of, that would just, but that just, kind of, so there are no-go rules in this area. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of, you've got to be careful, but you've got to be responsive to the potential new owner as well as the existing minister. What about you as a regulatory manager in a business?
Yeah, I think it would be of interest to know where you're coming from, to the extent that I want to pop up to the terrace and talk to you about what's going on. So that would be where I would come at that material. I think also, again, it's interesting, it's taking me as the commercial user, it's taking me back to the telco example, where, again, I'm sort of taken through the telco experience of how these promises made in opposition drove the regulatory process and shut down some of the key questions, and all became about implementation, what that did for the quality of the analysis, what that did for the public participation aspects and so on. So it's interesting, some of this will take you from two different spots. I'm getting directed to the same material.
And you really won't know until after the election and you've got a clear stare from the Prime Minister, read my lips which bit didn't get, or what we generally meant was, I mean, that's going to be very fluid.
Yes.
So the answer to that is be prepared, like the old Girls Guide motto,
Okay. Back to the top, having drilled down into some of the sort of the drivers for change quadrant, might then start thinking about some of the more analytical happenings down here in the bottom left. Click on regulatory management, thinking, right, having just got a little bit deflated by the fact that this is a policy developed in opposition and at least the experience from the telco sector that it's all going to be about how to do it rather than whether it should do it if these parties were to win the election. Clicking on regulatory management, okay, what are the hoops that this thing is going to have to get through? What is the ruler that's going to get run over this proposal? Again, I'll go first. I think, from my perspective, probably a lot of this is going to be new, right? Probably a lot of this is going to be a bit of an eye-opener as to the kind of processes that the proponents of this proposal are going to have to go through, and my opportunities for participation and intervention, if I was so minded. So this will be schooling up from my perspective. From yours, though, Derek?
Well, you'd mostly, kind of what's the plan to get a plan? So you'd mostly go to the cab guide stuff to sort of think, yeah, okay, so if we're going to get through this, what's the end-to-end process we're going to have to run? The cab guide's going to refer us on to the Treasury's REA handbook, and what the REA handbook's going to say is, design your REA process in at the beginning. So it's not a piece of dull compliance at the end, but it's a useful working tool as you go through. So that helps me think about the plan to get a plan. And behind that is some more detailed papers, a couple about the regulatory management system. And the other two is about the role of judicial review. And if you look at the history of telephony, if you look at the history of electricity, it's been extremely litigious. Chapman's River all over this. One of the things obviously you need to think about is how you're going to manage that end of the process. Whatever happens,
yes,
there's going to be parties on both sides of this who are going to take legal action.
Yes.
And you need to be thinking up front about the kind of the conduct phase and the kind of compliance phase.
Yep.
Because there's real resources at stake here.
Yep. Yep. And this is a good example of a spot where one of the things that, as a user, I would take from this is what Susy was talking about, stepping outside of role for a second, but the mixture of external sources and internal sort of research that's internal to the project. So there's a good mix here of research done in this context and the more practical, or I guess I get to know what kind of practical guidance is out there from my perspective, knowing what kind of hoops you have to work this thing through. Yep. Might click on, oh, no. So having got my head around that, accountability, monitoring, review and evaluation. So how is this policy proposal going to get treated once it's in place? Click on that. And again, some of the links that will be up under there say, again, take you back to the RIS handbook, the Australian Productivity Commission. Derek, you might talk to that. The cross-cutting theme papers. From my perspective, again, as the commercial guy, this is going to be new as well. I'm dealing with a government machinery that until now I haven't needed to know existed. Yep. All of a sudden, I'm sort of finding my way. So again, one of the things I'm looking for here is to start at the top of the pile, read a couple of the key documents which will give me a feel for it, and then an ability to drill down where I'm interested or chase after footnotes or whatever as I get going.
And from my side, I guess, if I want to come up with a plan to get a plan, you want to kind of plan through to the final outcome, and the final outcome is to kind of avoid the kind of policy overshooting that we're seeing. And how do you kind of institutionalise a more stable set of political bargains? So that would make me think about kind of how do we build in some review and some learning mechanism and build a broader constituency so that actually we can just stop randomly shocking the electricity market with perturbations and have no opportunity to learn.
Right.
So I'd start with the Treasury REA handbook. I'm sure the Treasury is going to improve the section of the REA handbook because at the moment it's pretty aspirational and doesn't give you anything practical. But the Australian Productivity Commission stuff it sort of says, well, there's 4 different types of reviews, and it gives you some examples of those, and that's kind of interesting. And there's a couple of papers there that talk about how you go about reviews, and a paper thinking about this as an experiment, which Peter Mumford keeps telling me about. Regulations are experiments; they're not kind of knowable in advance how they're going to unfold, and kind of our experience with electricity has been exactly that. So one option is a review clause, and so this is a link out of one of the papers, which is an example of a statutory review, and the annex analyses, basically there are about 3 different types of statutory reviews built into legislation, which is quite helpful because if we're thinking about changing the regulatory framework, whether we actually build in the formal requirement for review after a defined period of time, and some models of different types of review mechanisms that you can build into statutes. So that's kind of building that kind of learning and try and build a constituency for rather than these random political perturbations on the electricity system.
Yes.
So thinking it through kind of end to end from where we are now through to where we want to be so that we can learn our way forward rather than just have kind of random political experiments.
Yep. That does remind me, it's going to be very hard to build this one into the database, Susy, and you might have heard me say this before, but when on this train of thought, one of the consulting economists that I've worked with a fair bit, who's based in Hong Kong, and does work throughout Asia Pacific, and talking about New Zealand's uniqueness, he says, and he works from multiple jurisdictions, and he says the thing that marks New Zealand out is that every 5 years we throw the rule book up in the air and see what happens. And he doesn't see that behaviour in any of the other markets that he consults in. So, yeah. So maybe I could load that anecdote up on the database. Okay, so back in roll. So having drilled down into there, again, working our way through quantitative tools. Now, I might have clicked on this because I'm the regulatory manager at the electricity business. One of the things that was released during the press release was an economist's report about all the good things that were going to happen here. Burl, the producer, sort of a 5-pager. So I think, quantitative analysis, and so I click on here to see what's a more systematic way to get my head around quantitative analysis. Once it's built, there'll be things like these links here. One of them will take you to the paper that John spoke to yesterday, which sort of runs through all the different kinds of economic modelling and economic analysis and how they might fit into both the political process and the analytical process. That's going to be quite helpful for me because that will make me realise just what the Burl report does and doesn't do and how it sort of fits into an argument or not. So it turns out that with the benefit of having a look at this, what the Burl report does is take as a given so the policy proponents said we're going to make this big change to the electricity sector. We have calculated that the wholesale electricity price will drop by this much. Don't worry about checking our work on that. Take that as a given and then wash that through a general equilibrium model and tell us all the good things that will happen for the wholesale electricity price having dropped. And so Burl did. So, and it's all good news. So,
unsurprisingly.
But now at least I get to put that side by side with the work that John and Chris have done, and I can sort of put that in a bit of context, and I get a bit of a feel for what that does and doesn't say, and how useful or not useful it's going to be in all of this. And again, we also go back to external links. Treasury website's going to have some work on CBAs and so on.
And I won't comment.
You won't comment. No, I don't think you should.
On the basis it might be derogatory.
Yes. Right, and last, I'm of course interested in engaging on this stuff, so I'll be clicking on public voice and participation. And again, site under construction, but you can start to get a feel for how this is going to end up taking me to a variety of sources. Some of them will be the research that has been performed in this project that you've already heard about in the last day and a half. Some of it will be key articles and developments from other jurisdictions. And so I'm again going to get a feel for my ability to, where I can sort of expect or demand to have voice here, some sort of differing views as to the utility of all of that, and just basically get a feel for the landscape there as well.
And this will be quite tricky for this one, I would have thought. I mean, assuming that kind of, read my lips, which bit didn't you get, this is the policy in the government and there's been a change of administration, then kind of you can't run a green paper, white paper process. I mean, kind of...
No, that's right.
Kind of direction is travel is clear. All you're going to be consulting on is how you do it, not whether you do it. Mm. So that's going to be quite tricky to develop.
Right. So at the end of all of that, yeah, reflections on, like as a user, so reflections on where I've landed. I think I've got a lot of reading to do. But I've started from a position of not having had visibility of that landscape to now having a sort of a portfolio of different inputs that I can then scan, get my head around, and I can start at the top. I can start with the key academic articles. I can start with the key external links to the practical reports that are there. I've got the ability to drill down further if there's a particular area that I want to focus on, but I've been able to scan the various ways into this topic. And I guess the other thing that I've got is that that there's a bunch of different disciplines, right? So I haven't got just legal articles, or I haven't just got economic reports. I've got a bunch of different takes on this. So I've got a place to sort of lay it all out on the table and start. I haven't found the answer, but that's not what this is about. But I have found a way to sort of start at the top of each topic, and then I've got the ability to drill in where my sort of interest in whatever take me.
And my comment will be similar, I guess. It's not kind of like a database, or Susy talked about it as being a database where you get lost in and never go out, and it's not simply an index of what's there. It's more kind of layers of knowledge, and the idea that your classic academic article just has N references, but you have no sense of what's the good stuff and what's the also-rans and what's the don't bother to go there. And so the idea that there's going to be a bit of a sift and sort and kind of helpful links which are layered in some way, I think is going to be quite useful. And it's accessing the kind of practitioner literature, the Australian Productivity Commission, the Treasury Risk Guidance, where it's helped solving problems, some academic stuff about how you might think about that, and some practice examples. And I think kind of nice mixture of sort of layered knowledge and good stuff sorted out from the dross, because the trouble with Google is, other than hits, you don't know what's good. All right.
And now we go away and do our reading.
Yep.
So we're going to pass to John again if you have questions.
I'm not going to be very long, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. What I just want to do is to pick up essentially on the point that Derek made at the end, which is to stress for us what's different about this. If this isn't a database, whether or not you'd get lost in it, then exactly kind of what model did we have in our mind and why did we think it was useful? And the model builds on the kind of remarks that Derek's just said. We were conscious of the fact that first of all, there's so much stuff out there in internet land that we could find and link to this, that just trying to keep up with it would have occupied all of our time. Secondly, that as soon as you've done that, there's another group of papers being produced and another group of things that you might put on there. We couldn't possibly be comprehensive, so we went for another model, and the model was essentially related to the points that Derek just made. The thought that we have is that there are two ways you can go about getting briefed up on something. Either you can start searching around in the books or the internet, or you can go and ask somebody, what should I have to read? You know this topic better than I do. How would you go about it? And the kind of underlying model we've got in this is to reflect in the toolkit a degree of judgment and omission, deliberately leaving out stuff that we didn't rate as being particularly helpful or important. So the idea is to focus what's in the toolkit on the things that a trusted advisor would most get you to read. Now, we've made a good start on this. We've also reflected strongly the areas where the interest of the project participants went. As Susy said yesterday, we pushed some of those poor participants, and I'll hold my hand up as being one of those, outside levels of comfort into areas that we weren't necessarily feeling fully confident with in the first place, but I think all the papers developed contributions and went places. So what we're looking for, I suppose now, apart from criticisms, is comments where people can put forward their own favourite little ideas that they feel are not well enough drawn on in making regulation or in assessing regulation or in the whole process, because there are forgotten masterpieces out there as well as nice overviews. And we'd like to hear about those. We're all going to put our own favourites up there. And we'd also like to think about ways in which one of the things that's come out of the role play to me is that you you start thinking about high-level categories of users, and you roll out scholars and learners, but it's only when you drill down, as the role play did, into particular different bits of detail on particular different uses that you might put it to, that you start to see that those uses don't overlap a lot. There's some basic material, but the specifics that people are looking for are going to be different, and they'll be drawing different material out of those. So this is, you know, it's a rich field, and almost all the papers that we've prepared come down to, yes, there's some general frameworks, but there's a lot of horses for courses in getting regulation smart and good. And that the contrast and tension between those two is what we're going to have to try and reflect in the toolkit, but that there's no easy solutions here, because there's no master underlying string theory that pulls all this stuff together with or without empirical applications. So I'll stop there.
So we'll shortly go to your questions. I'll just say two things. So I mentioned at the beginning a form of user testing. So what we're hoping to do, you can see that we've put quite a bit of effort in how to structure and build this. And in fact, this page, with which you're familiar, has been informing these particular headings. We've actually had lengthy discussions. You know, this is a case of lengthy discussions to get short rather than lengthy discussions to get long. And there's been a lot of sort of interdisciplinary, what on earth do you mean by this, sort of discussions. And then we've, as we've demonstrated, formed these pathways. Now, of course, all of us in putting this together, and there are a couple more participants in forming the toolkit as well. Joel Colin Reus wasn't able to join us today. And Helen McQueen also. So, he's sleeping. Yes, he's sleeping after some jet lag experience. We've really sort of toed and froed and created these paths. What we're interested in doing, but we don't really want to waste people's time and get you in on this too early, is we're going to have some targeted groups where we ask you to go through a couple of paths and give us your very specific feedback on, did we get those headings right, or when we put up legal methods, did you not have the slightest idea what we're talking about? But we want to design that user testing so that it's specific to groups. So we've had interest from various groups, and we're going to work on that. Probably that'll take us at least 3 or 4 more weeks to get there, but more on that. So that's what I meant by the detailed user testing phase. But at this particular stage, we welcome your comments, questions, and so on, to all or any of us.